Everyone. My name is Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, and I'm the director of the Earth Rights Advocacy Clinic at NYU Law and of the Climate Litigation Accelerator that hosts this series of webinars and also this really exciting dynamic community of practice that you all have been part of in the last couple of years. And this is a really special occasion for us and the community of practice because we're starting a new academic year in the Northern Hemisphere, and we're doing so with the launch of two outputs that the CLX team has been working on very hard over the last couple of years. We see a role in our community of practice as a facilitator for pausing and reflecting, also celebrating strides and strategizing about how to become smarter in the climate struggle. In other words, we want to ensure that we all accelerate in the right direction. So we think that this is an opportune moment to look back, and with that, to look forward as rights-based climate litigation, which started only very recently in the early 2010s and picked up in the mid-2010s, enters a new stage of maturity. So with this webinar, we're launching a 4-part webinar series that does exactly that. It looks back to what we have achieved as a community, also what we have been lacking, what's missing in climate litigation, and also how we can, and also reflecting on how we can use tools like the toolkit that we're launching today, the book that we're announcing today, to speed up further climate litigation and make it even more impactful. So to aid us with that task, we are launching two outputs today. The first one, and I'm going to share my screen because this is better shown than told. This is the CLX Climate Litigation Accelerator. Melina will kindly reshare the link. And it really is a common good. We thought of it as a common good. It's, of course, everything is open access, and it's meant to offer tools, hence its name, to climate litigants, researchers, scholars, practitioners, students. And by the way, this series of webinars will aim to offer and to highlight the tools to those 4 publics and also judges. So we'll have today a webinar with outstanding practitioners from around the world. We will also have another webinar with judges, another one with practitioners, and then with members of the youth movement, trying to gauge the usefulness of the toolkit, but also more importantly and substantively, looking at what the movement has achieved and what we need to be doing next. So the toolkit is, again, I won't take too much time presenting this to you because you can go straight to the page. But basically, it offers 4 types of resources. It describes legal actions that we have engaged in and other organizations have engaged in. We share all of our publications, blogs, ebooks, and others. Importantly, and I think this is going to be particularly helpful for practitioners and judges and scholars, we have invested a lot of time and effort into writing pedagogical case books, the case studies. So we have a case book that, for example, I will just click on any case here that digests highly complex and sometimes lengthy legal materials in ways that can be used by practitioners relatively easily. So we hope there's a background to each case, but this is not just descriptive. We highlight what the strategic lessons of each of the cases are, what the holdings of the courts have been when there's a final case, and also what the impact has been. So we hope that, and finally, we also offer video materials. We're developing an online educational series. So stay tuned. We hope to launch that by the end of the semester. And finally, our events. So I'll stop there. I won't speak too much about the other output that we're presenting today because it's a collective book that's titled Litigating the Climate Emergency that Puven and on to our speakers today. And if we had met Vivian when we were preparing this book, we would have invited her to write a chapter. But Melina, my colleague Melina Debona, who will take it from here, will describe the book as we go along. And we do hope that these resources will be of use to all of you. And we're keen finally to get your feedback, iterate, improve the toolkit in light of your comments and suggestions. So with that, Melina, why don't you take it from here?
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Cesar, and thank you to the three of you for being here. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Melina, and I am Cesar's colleague at the Climate Litigation Accelerator. I'm a litigation associate there. So just as we move through this conversation, I want to please ask the three of you, but also the audience, to keep in mind the CLX toolkit that Cesar just went through. As Cesar mentioned, both the book called Litigating the Climate Emergency, but also the toolkit are products that we created in collaboration with you. We have two of the authors of the book sitting here, and also we received a lot of input from people and continue to use this toolkit with people like Vivian to test it and see ways that it can be improved. So at the end of the session, we'll have a moment where through the chat, the audience can write ways that they would like to see the toolkit improved. So I ask that you keep that in mind as we move towards this reflection. I'll introduce the speakers now. So as Cesar mentioned, this is a series. This is actually a 4-part series in which we hope to hear from judges, from scholars, from youth, and today from practitioners. These practitioners are, as you know, because many of you are also in the same boat, but they are at the forefront of the climate litigation field, and they're people who we work closely with. So first we have Vivian Ferreira. She's an attorney and legal advisor at the Brazilian Association of Members of the Public Ministry for the Environment, that is called ABRAMPA in Brazil. She's also has her own practice where she advises on climate, environmental, and administrative law. We also have Pooven Moodley, who's Executive Director of Natural Justice, who's a human rights lawyer and social justice activist from South Africa. Before joining Natural Justice, he was the Associate Country Director at Oxfam in South Africa and the Global Head of Campaigning for Action Aid International. Lastly, but not least, we have Michelle Jonker-Argueta, who is a Senior Legal Counsel for Strategic Litigation at Greenpeace International. She oversees Greenpeace International strategic litigation work and advises on the development and implementation of legal strategies to hold governments and, importantly, corporations accountable for climate change and biodiversity loss, as well as human rights violations. So thank you to the three of you for being here, and we'll jump right into what will be a retrospective, honest reflection about the climate litigation field and some of your work as it exemplifies broader themes of the field. So the first question, which I will direct to the three of you, but I will like Pooven to start with, is what has the field of climate change litigation gotten right? So just to give you an example, what are some norms or some trends that you have identified in the last years of development of the field that you think, your gut feeling is telling you that we have gotten right? Pooven, I read your chapter, and I hope everyone else does too, in Litigating the Climate Emergency. Pooven's chapter was called "The Tide of Climate Litigation is Upon Us in Africa." And it called my attention as a hopeful chapter. At least it gave me hope in the sense that you really explore the increasing centrality of community voices, the protection of different constitutional rights, and what I see as the growing scope of natural resources that can be protected through climate litigation. So on that hopeful note, I will start with Pooven, followed by Michelle and Vivian to see what we have done right.
Yeah, thanks so much, Melina. I'd say probably 2 or 3 key things I think we've done right. When we first started looking at climate litigation across the African continent, it was quite a lonely place in the sense of, looking for others that were doing climate litigation at the time. And I remember us doing some initial kind of research at Natural Justice to see, what are the other cases across the globe. And that's in fact how we found Cesar and the others that were involved, the folks from Agenda and other places. And in that sense, it's become quite a community of practice, now being able to connect with different practitioners from across the globe on a range of issues. I mean, even just being at the last COP in Glasgow, there was a workshop around how to defeat Shell, and that's the exact moment when we found out that Shell was going to do this massive oil and gas exploration in South Africa. So I think what you're finding with lawyers starting to work much more closely around climate litigation is there's a lot more, sharing of ideas, strategies, and so on. And, to the point you feel like, okay, if somebody took on a multinational and won, why can't we do that here? And that's exactly what we did. And last week we got an amazing judgment, around Shell not being able to do the oil and gas exploration. But a couple of things through that, which I want to point out here. A is, we've been pushing for many years this idea that litigation shouldn't be about lawyers, it should be about communities. And communities are central to litigation. And in a lot of the cases we're currently involved in across the African continent, a big part of that is about communities, driving this. This was the same with the Shell case, for example. It was communities being the applicants, communities that were, organizing, etc. And we as lawyers were providing, the necessary legal kind of backup and strategy and so on. And I think, that's really exciting to see how climate litigation is evolving, in that sense. And the last thing I'll say is, generally within civil society, that traditionally there's always, operated in a very competitive way, which is unhelpful. And given that this is, potentially the biggest struggle of our lives at the moment, the current kind of climate crisis and planetary crisis, lawyers starting to work together on cases has made a massive difference. I mean, that was the case in Shell one recently, working with a range of organizations, Natural Justice Working, Greenpeace, but also a range of, key lawyers within the country, for example. And that, I think, has also shifted over the last few years. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks. So I'll jump in and of course, plus one to everything that Pooven was talking about. There are a couple of new things I wanted to add, but just to echo that having the different local affected communities connected globally, having the jurisprudence being pushed further in different jurisdictions, and having us being able to cite comparative law or international law or legal principles in different jurisdictions has made a big difference in a positive way. I feel like we as lawyers are listening more to affected communities and really striving to support litigation as a community-led effort through, for example, the movement lawyering approach, what some people call that. It's something that I see many embracing, joining and mobilizing the different struggles around the world under that common struggle for our planet, for the protection of rights that are universal. It's something that the movement has gotten right. And then I think that the new thing that I wanted to add is that I think through litigation and through the efforts in climate litigation specifically, we see that the exposure of the broken narratives from the industry and also from governments has come through both inside the courtroom and outside. We've seen, for example, in the Philippines Human Rights Commission report that they found that there was an obfuscation of climate science. There was a deliberate effort by the industry to mislead, misinform, and cast doubt on their role in causing the climate crisis and it being an anthropogenic phenomenon that affects human rights. So we've seen that. We've seen through different judgments as well that the narrative about corporations not being able to go it alone or governments not being able to do anything because it's a global problem. You've seen a lot of courts reject that and say, hey, you have responsibility for your part in the problem, even if it's global and even if other players are not doing the same. We've seen that, of course, in the Hague judgment, also against Shell. We've seen that to a certain extent in the People vs. Arctic Oil judgment. We've seen that in Argentina recently in a successful injunction proceeding. So it's really about, I think, something that the movement has gotten right is just exposing that narrative that we have to wait, we should just work together, and there's no time now. Everybody has to do their part and take their responsibility for the harm that has been caused and prevent future harm. So that's something that I see that the movement has gotten right, and also just having the courage to push the law further and really show, when you look at the judgments that have been quote unquote successful, you see that it's as simple as having courts apply the law to the facts. When the court accepts climate science, when the court accepts that there are certain duties that governments are owe people, and that certain obligations that corporations need to also abide by, then you see when there's that kind of simple application of law to facts, you see a successful judgment. You think, all right, there is that inspiration, there is that momentum, there is that kind of joint struggle for the survival of our species in this existential threat. Over.
Hi. So jumping in now, I think I need to echo everything Puvan and Michelle just said. I agree with everything they said. And talking about Brazil, which is where I work and I have a closer look at, I really believe that international cases have helped a lot for us to develop national cases as inspiration. So you get the Urgenda case, Shell versus Media Defense case. There are cases that are very important, that were very important and are being quoted in decisions. So I think that that's very important. For strengthening this community of practice is very, very important. And I wanted to draw attention to one aspect of the things that have worked well. And I think the book you're launching today talks exactly about that, is to litigate climate change from a human rights perspective. So very recently in Brazil, the Supreme Court has decided a case about a climate fund. I had the opportunity to work in that case representing Abrampa. We filed amicus briefs on the merits of the case. In short, I think probably all of you know the case, but basically what the court has done was that it recognized that the Paris Agreement is a human rights treaty and it has binding effects, legal effects in terms of national regulation. So that's very innovative, and that helps us with other cases, because now judges will feel like, okay, this is not just in the international sphere, it has legal binding effects in Brazil. A second thing, it recognized that the right to a healthy environment encompasses the right to climate stability. And that has very important implications, obviously, because you can bring climate litigation cases to the Supreme Court, but also it means that you can manage a whole set of legal tools and institutions to promote climate change litigation. By bringing climate change litigation closer to human rights and environmental law, you can bring public prosecutors to the table in a very definite way here in Brazil. And that's something very peculiar to our context, because I think also in most of Latin America, the same happens, that public prosecutors, they are responsible for taking action to protect human rights and fundamental rights, such as the right to a healthy environment. And so they have traditionally been very active and very successful in these cases. And so they are also spread across all of the country. They understand and know how to operate according to local regional particularities. So that's a very empowering tool, I think.
Great. So thank you for those reflections. I think I will use Vivian's last few words as a hook to remind the three of you, but also the audience, that we as CLX are very much interested in helping partners through these actions. We were also part of the Climate Fund case, and we're able to get some experts to write expert opinions in addition to amicus briefs. But also in terms of the human right and climate change nexus, Vivian, that you mentioned, if you look at the CLX toolkit, we actually have the largest, I believe, database in the world when it comes to climate change human rights cases. So that's part of the toolkit, and it will be mentioned also it's in the book that has already come out in Spanish, but will be coming out in Portuguese and English this coming month. So do please take a look at that. And lastly, we do work on the right to healthy environment as well, working with Special Rapporteur David Boyd and other key actors in Brazil and around the world to really push for that. So that being said, like Puven, Michelle, and Vivian mentioned, I think there are really important strides in terms of what the movement has achieved in modality of work, right? The idea that we're, the three of you, the four of us, I guess, are in very different places, and we're able to come together and have this conversation, but also in terms of the achieving justice, but also the judicial system, right? So we see both, like Michelle mentioned, jurisprudential developments, but we also see judges being willing to, quote unquote, take more risk or expand their comfort level when it comes to the climate field. So I appreciate those reflections. Well, now turning to the other side of the coin, I would like to ask to the three of you, what has the field gotten wrong, and what is it missing, if perhaps a better way to conceptualize it? And I will like to start this question with Michelle. So Michelle wrote also a chapter for Litigating the Climate Emergency book, and her chapter is called Closing the Supply Side Accountability Gap Through Climate Litigation. So Michelle, in it, while you do have a hopeful note and you evaluate the lessons that people can learn from cases like the People versus the Arctic Oil, in which you state that the judiciary can play a more active role in bridging the accountability gap that exists regarding greenhouse gas emissions on the supply side. I really like a quote that you stated that says, "It is time to address the drill rig-sized elephant in the room," right? So there are obvious problems that we still have to deal with, particularly in that moment you were talking about the fact that policymakers are really focusing on the demand side of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's not sufficient, as we know, for meeting the Paris Agreement targets and meeting targets that are going to keep us safe. But in addition, curbing the fossil fuel production continues to be unaddressed by the legislature and the judiciary. So if you could perhaps start us on this trend of line of thinking, perhaps explore a little what you were talking about in your chapter, and add anything else that you think we are missing, and then we can move on to Vivian and Puven.
Thanks so much. Yes. So in the chapter, we do explore the imperative to look at curbing production. As you know, we've discovered more than enough fossil fuels to bring us beyond the targets, the Paris temperature targets. And it is something that we don't see right now happening at the political level, but you do see it now in courts. Of course, the People versus Arctic Oil was successful in the sense that the Supreme Court saw that it was a responsibility of the Norwegian state to take into account the scope 3, or what we call exported emissions, from fossil fuels in their environmental impact assessment. The problem with the judgment, from my perspective, is that the court really saw, the gravity and severity of the climate crisis, but it missed the mark on the urgency, finding that this analysis had to be done because it's 95% of emissions that were not taken into account until that point. But it saw that it could be done later. So of course, the youth in Norway moved forward with their calls for justice before now the European Court of Human Rights. But you saw in the Hague District Court judgment in Shell, in the Milieu Defensie case, I think that Vivian also referred to, you saw also a scope 3 emission finding, saying, hey, you actually can control what is being consumed because you control the supply. So if there was no, there's that kind of, in the book chapter, I talk about the drug dealer defense, and if you've ever seen the movie Scarface, you see that, never get high on your own supply. That's kind of Norway's way of, being green at home, but really continuing to fuel the world's addiction to fossil fuels, delaying the transition, delaying also the just transition, as you say, and delaying us, relying on green energy. So that's something that I'm hoping that through litigation we can start addressing. I think that the accountability gap that we see in other areas is quite big, and we should really start addressing it. One of the things that I think it's missing, and I see it now being developed more and more, is looking at basically money in politics. So the money that goes in the processes to set the agenda for energy policy. I think in the last COP, we had a huge delegation from the industry and a very, very small delegation from NGOs because of COVID rules or whatever. But it was actually quite telling to see kind of like the industry still being there, still pushing for that policy to favor them. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the Norwegian government's response in the People vs. Arctic Oil case, now before the European Court. But now they were saying, hey, we need to continue our fossil fuel expansion because of the war in Ukraine. So, there's always going to be one of these arguments and these types of narratives that we just need to break through and show the court that actually it's time to address the problem of supply. And it's not just a demand issue. We're beyond that at this point. So that's what I explore in the chapter. And and I look forward to hearing from others what they see as the next opportunities. Not a failure to this point, but just next opportunities, I would say.
Okay, so I would like to draw on something that Michelle just pointed out, I think, about the difficulties in making the justice system understand the urgency of climate action. We feel that in a daily basis. And I think that has to do with the need to strengthen the understanding of climate science by all parts of the justice system. I think that's a very big challenge ahead of us. I think not only lawyers, but also judges and public prosecutors here in Brazil. I'm glad to hear that you're going to host an event with judges as well, because if they don't understand the structure of the Paris Agreement, then climate litigation can be gravely impaired. And there's no doubt about that. Also, if a judge does not see truly, does not understand exactly how climate change is already affecting us and may result in tragedies often in particular areas, it's much harder for them to grant an injunction, for example, for adaptation measures. So I think investing in cases, in classes, courses, academic events, books, and making sure that this information reaches the legal system is crucial to the success of climate change litigation. And another thing that I think is a challenge, and I think we're working on that, but I think we can always improve in it, is that climate change litigation has to be strategic, and we cannot afford the time we may lose if a clumsy lawsuit results in a negative precedent. And so I think we really need to think about minimizing risks and be clever about how and when and where we should bring a case. And so that's why I think it's very important to strengthen a network of actors, including NGOs, university lawyers, researchers, public prosecutors, everybody. So we can make sure that the strategies are all well studied and validated, somehow put to test internally before they go out to courts.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think, judges and legal practitioners being able to connect the dots is absolutely crucial, to start shifting some of this. But also, I think, there's currently a very small pool of lawyers that are, let's say experts are focusing on this issue and looking at how to ensure that, there's a bigger pool of legal practitioners, both from the private sector, but also the public interest sector as well. But the other point for me is, the challenge, even with this latest Shell victory, is that there's another 148 oil and gas projects across the African coastline over the next 5 years that's either been approved or in the pipeline. So, how does one deal with that scale? And again, I think, it is about us coming together to work collectively to deal with this, because if they stop one place, they can start in the next place, etc., etc. So in terms of that global scale, I think, multinationals have the resources, etc. And I think the only way we can defeat them is you know, on that scale is for us to really be, you know, working much closely. The other point for me is I think, you know, judges are slowly starting to, you know, look at, and even in this last case, look at, you know, things beyond what was normally discussed. I mean, obviously there's been a lot of progress in terms of rights of nature, you know, other types of cases. But one of the key arguments we put forward was the spiritual connection to the ocean in this case. And that was a very, you know, besides all of the other kind of legal arguments about assessments and so on, that played a key role. And, you know, in some ways we were even surprised, you know, that the judge took it that seriously. But that was a major factor. And I think us continuing to push, you know, the kind of indigenous knowledge, indigenous connection to land and ocean, etc. I think there's much more work, you know, that can be done in that area beyond looking at the traditional or, let's say, Western science that's presented in court as well.
Thank you, Bhuvan. Yes, I think that's great. The idea of traditional knowledge being really brought in and you know, valued as much as Western scientific outlooks is really important, and something I agree we definitely should move towards. So one last question in terms of our reflection, looking backwards. I will ask you to pick one just for the sake of time. But if you had to pick one thing that you would do the same way and one thing that you would do differently, what would it be? I'll start with Vivian. I know this is a bit of a harder question, but I think Vivian, you know, CLX has worked with Vivian on training public prosecutors because they're key actors. So Vivian, I don't know if you want to go in that route or if you would like to pick a different experience you've ever had as an attorney. I will let you choose, but I'm really curious to hear one thing you would do the same way and something you would do differently.
Yeah, so I think the classes with public prosecutors is a work in progress still. I'm not sure I can evaluate what I would do different yet, but I'm very happy to share with you that it's been a success so far. So they're very engaged, they feel very interested. I think it's working very well so far. So I'll let you know by the end of it what I would do differently. But there's something that we've been working with Abrampa that we've been trying to use environmental licensing as a tool for climate action. In many cases, obviously in Brazil, companies need license to operate, and therefore the government can demand that climate impacts of projects are reduced. It could also foster the development of low carbon activities, but it's not true in practice. Climate impacts are not usually evaluated. So with the help of a consultant, a number of experts, civil society, Abrampa has developed a document which basically explains how to evaluate climate impacts. It outlines like minimum contents, fundamental methodological assumptions, etc. We then presented this document to public prosecutors in all regions of Brazil, along with a legal analysis that summarized the arguments that they could use and suggested that they would present this document to competent authorities and press them into adjusting their regulations on the matter to make the requirement more explicit. And the strategy of structuring a robust technical basis to present a case against the government has proven quite effective. Indeed, in some states, judicial action wasn't even necessary. In the state of Paraná, for example, the sheer proposal has already led to the enactment of a local norm that establishes the need to evaluate climate impacts of companies during the licensing process. So, you know, that really helps. But while the initiative was cherished by public prosecutors in general, and many are indeed taking action, like we suggested, we ran into a few difficulties. So initially, we imagined an extrajudicial approach, and eventually, if needed, a lawsuit against the state demanding that competent authorities would make this requirement of assessing climate impacts explicit. But in fact, we found that most prosecutors prefer to litigate specific enterprises. So we realized that maybe we also needed to take a more case-specific approach. So legal strategy is a bit hard to generalize. It has to be modeled according to the peculiarities of different regions. And so we are now working on ways we can help that happen, looking to specific enterprises. And we were actually looking into oil and gas industry So, the cases Michelle just presented to us will be very helpful. And second, we find that public prosecutors are generally overwhelmed with work. They litigate environmental law in Brazil in 2022. I know you probably know that we have had a lot of setbacks in that area. So they have a lot of work. So we need a strategy to foster also mobilization around the climate agenda, so that these technical tools that are developed are actually used to the best of their extent. And one of the ways we're trying to do that is actually by offering that course, the classes and the workshops that CLX has been helping us with.
Whoever can take it. Michelle, I saw you wanting to say something.
Well, I was wondering if it was my turn. I was like, I completely forgot who's next. So I'll just say a couple of words. It's a bit, well, I should first say that, Greenpeace International supports the different Greenpeace organizations around the world in their litigation. So the efforts that I'm talking about are not necessarily things I've been personally involved in deeply. But I would like, for example, to talk about the Philippines Human Rights Commission investigation. That was an effort that went on for many years, resulting from first the Typhoon Haiyan and the survivors who wanted to hold corporate actors to account for their part in causing and exacerbating and denying climate change. And I think that, something that I think from being outside the project, something that has been so inspiring is seeing the deep community engagement. And I feel like that's something that should be done the same if we could do it all over again. There's been a lot of, there was a lot of capacity building, skill sharing both ways. So us learning from the local affected communities and us also, sharing some knowledge on paralegal skills and media training, etc. So that was something that was quite successful because it took many years for the commission to publish their report with very strong findings. But in that time, it was quite important, I think, for the community to have the ability to still, continue their advocacy efforts to build each other's power and to be able to wield that counterpower, against the industry. So I feel like that could be done the same. And what I think could be done different is for us in other projects to learn from that more. I think deeper community engagement could be done in many of the projects that we have done. I think that we are striving more to apply that movement lawyering approach. I think that Puven was also pretty much talking about in terms of, looking at traditional knowledge, working together with affected communities, having them really define what is their vision of justice and co-create with affected communities the remedies that we would be seeking from the court. So that's something that we could do more across the board in different projects. So I think that that's something that I would like to, we're striving to do more, but I would like to see it like even more. So that's something we're advocating for as well in the different projects that we're involved in. I think it's you asked us to think about the theory of change, I think ahead of time, and I was thinking it is for us, I think, to support the local affected communities to take the lead in defining their own destiny and finding their own version of justice, defining the problem, finding the solution, and that's something that I think it's important for us to do and help those communities build their own power so that once the quote unquote big NGOs leave, once the lawyers pack up their briefcases and go, the communities can continue and advocate for their own rights and fight their own struggles as well.
Yeah, I fully agree with that and fully support that, and we really believe that's absolutely crucial. That longer term work with communities. Now, the other thing I would add to that is, I guess a multi-pronged approach. Often as lawyers, we kind of just look at the litigation or the courtroom, but how that all works in tandem with the advocacy, with the kind of public action, and most of the cases we've been involved in, those things played such a key role, and the interplay, between them in putting pressure, in bringing international attention, to something. And also, like with the East Africa pipeline case, the fact that, many banks have already pulled out, given, the pressure that's being put, even without having gone through the full legal process. So, I think in terms of strategy and tactics, that becomes absolutely crucial. I think that the last thing I would say is, never take, lawyers, whether it's senior counsel or anyone, as word, as being sacred. I think it's important to keep pushing the boundaries. I mean, even in many of the cases, we put in arguments that we thought, or the, senior counsel thought that's not going to fly, or it may deviate or something. But, that helps to set, more and more precedent. So I think that's really crucial.
Great, thank you. Yes, I really like this idea, perhaps for a future CLX project, of sort of coming together, which we do already, right? But we don't necessarily come together behind closed doors, because I'm sure a webinar of this would be a little, I don't know if organizations would be too into it, but coming together and really reflecting on lessons learned of a project, right? So being honest about what worked and what did not work in the same way we're doing here, but about a specific project, and making sure that in that we involve other perspectives that we as lawyers often don't include in these conversations, like community perspectives, so that we can build sort of better lessons and more inclusive lessons that will lead to more strengthening of the field. I think that would be great. Perhaps you'll get an email with some sort of test with that. Great. So in these last 15 minutes we have, I would like to jump into a perspective analysis. What's coming next? I would like to close with 2 questions for the 3 of you, but also for the audience. So if you are in the audience watching, feel free to write in the chat. I know that the Q&A is also available for you, and we'll take a look at it soon to see what people have been saying. But this is the question. So from the point of view of a practitioner, what tools would you like to see added to the CLX toolkit? We really work with everything that was just said. We were really trying to strengthen the toolkit to give you some of the tools that you would like to see, and that can help you, quote unquote, like Cesar said, accelerate in the right direction. So for anyone listening, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we look forward to collecting these comments. Anyone can go. Michelle, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Melina. And it's funny you mentioned this learnings. I think when I was looking at the toolkit, I thought, it's a really great source for inspiration, for information. It has to be a little bit from the perspective of the user. It has to be a little bit distilled. So I don't know if there's a way to distill some of those learnings in some sort of analysis. But when it comes to learnings and what sometimes people call falling forward, so learning from things, in hindsight is 2020, as they say. I think that learnings, whether submitted through a way that you can anonymize it or have that, maybe you have a meeting, closed doors, and then from there you come up with learnings. I think that we're all learning in this field, even if people have been doing it for many years. We can always learn from people that just entered the field. We are constantly learning from those who are most affected by the climate crisis. So I think that having I don't know how would be like a channel to exchange these types of learnings is something that I think that the accelerator could facilitate. You guys are truly a connector of people, or like the butter, in the Pyrex when you're making a pie, like making things connect and come together. So just facilitating that sharing of that know-how, from the global south with the global south in a way that where we're really listening. That's something that I would love to see. So I'm going to stop there and hear from others.
Yeah, I guess maybe. Sorry, Vivian, you want to go? Yeah, just a couple of things building on that. I think, it's a great resource. And as I said at the beginning, when we started doing this work and started looking at stuff, it was really difficult. So having one place to go to is incredible. I think a couple of things, one of the things we were thinking about as we're working more closely with environmental justice lawyers in Africa is also to kind of have a mapping of lawyers, not just the cases, but the resource people. And I think that's really useful, especially for communities, whatever country you're from, there's a list of people that you can kind of connect with. I think the other thing is, and Michelle, you I think spoke a bit about this, but I think having a kind of active forum where people can actually ask questions, and not that every question is going to be answered, but if it becomes interactive in that sense, information can flow and so on. Obviously those become difficult to moderate and so on. But anyway, thinking through something like that. And the last thing to say, I think, is often what gets highlighted is the bigger, well-known cases, but just thinking through some of the smaller cases which also are quite significant, and how does one start mapping some of those as well.
Yeah, I think everybody here loves the casebook. I love the casebook. I think it's very easy to use and very helpful. And I think it's crucial that you have filters there, but maybe those filters could be improved. So I thought maybe not only strategies, but also maybe the types of emissions targeted by the case. Maybe the emission sector would be useful for research focused in specific areas, or I don't know, like deforestation, energy. And I always find it very interesting to know more about the backstage of an important climate case. And I know you have interviews with key legal actors, so maybe, I don't know if it's possible to include the link in the casebook. So maybe that would be a way to make information easier to find. And I was very excited that you have a sector dedicated to events. And I look forward to having more and maybe periodic events on climate change litigation, maybe where we can discuss cases, papers about the field. And I think it's very, as Michelle Denpouven pointed out, that's where we can draw a lot from and learn from past experiences. So I think meeting people over and over again periodically has a very, very important value. And I'm pretty sure that CLX can be a very important actor to help that happen.
Absolutely, thank you. And talking about what Pooven mentioned, so the idea of having some sort of forum too, it's something, I'm glad Pooven that you brought that up, because it's something that CLX has been considering, and we are interested to hear if that would actually be of use and be used. So thank you so much, Pooven, for bringing that up. We'll definitely keep exploring that idea. As a follow-up question, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, and one is directed towards Michelle, but I think perhaps Michelle and Vivian can both touch upon this question. It's from Rick Hitty, and it says, Michelle made the crucial point that courts must eventually recognize that substantial responsibility for product-related Scope 3 emissions. So for people watching this, those are emissions that are used by the final consumer, right? So it's the idea of emissions all the way down to the consumer level of corporations taking responsibility for that. But so they must take responsibility for Scope 3 emissions, and climate damages must be attributed to producers, whether nations or whether that's companies. The question is, how can we help educate courts and prosecutors on this issue, or otherwise press the issue? So I like to bring this question up because I think it goes hand in hand with what we're discussing now, which is how can CLX help you, help educate on the issue, whether that's courts or prosecutors, as mentioned here. If you put yourself in the mindset that you have to educate, the courts and the prosecutors on something like this, like Scope 3 emissions, how would you do it? Is my way of rephrasing this question, and how can we help you?
Maybe I'll just jump in, then actually to throw it to Vivian, who does this kind of work. I mean, you, with the experience that you have training prosecutors, how would you do that? My initial feeling is we have to educate courts in different jurisdictions about how other courts are approaching this issue and interpreting the science. The fact that in the Hague case, the Milli Defensi versus Shell case, was something like 85% of emissions that were not taken into account, Scope 3. And in Norway, it was 95%. And you think, at those numbers, how is it that we've been doing this for so long and not taking these emissions into account? How is it that nobody has thought about, hey, maybe there wouldn't be so much consumption if there wasn't so much supply? So these are the things. It could be that, you know, there's a whole layer of lobbying behind the scenes with how, you know, we've been doing mostly demand side cases. But I think that, you know, I feel like once you start reasoning, showing the data and showing that it is actually quite possible to reduce emissions by reducing the production and the supply to begin with, I think that education is going to be very important. But perhaps Vivian knows, I know the what, but not really the how.
Yeah, I agree with you, Michelle, about the what. And I can say that we've been looking at oil and gas right now in Brazil, and I think numbers are very close to those that you pointed out, about around 80, 90, even more than 90% of emissions are scope 3. And I think there's a technical detail that these companies are exploring, that is that the GHG protocol, that is the methodology that they use to you know, estimate scope 1, 2, and 3. It establishes that scope 3 is optional. It's optional from a methodological point of view. It's not optional from a legal point of view. And I think they're transposing that. So, oh no, it says it's optional. You know, who said it's optional? So I think that there's a discussion there. And we've been trying to work on educating prosecutors. So that's what we've done, because it's easy to explain to a prosecutor how, if you explain how emissions work, there is a lot of learning to happen. You know, it depends on where the person is relating to climate crisis. I don't know. Some people don't really understand how it works and what's happening and how fossil fuels work and why they contribute to the crisis. So it depends too much on who you're talking to, but most people understand the problem, and they just don't understand the technicalities of the problem. And so I think that has to be explained. And I think classes, courses, books are very important in that sense, but also public awareness. You know, it has to be on the media. It has to be on papers. People need to start reading about this on papers. I think that's very important to raise awareness. And also, I think from a legal strategy point of view, it's not interesting. I think it might be interesting to approach the problem a little slowly, especially, for example, here in Brazil, we have a problem. Oil is something that people think that economy may depend on that. There are a lot of jobs at stake. So there's a lot of arguments that can be thrown in this argument. If you're going to fight oil here in Brazil, I know those arguments will come up. And so you need to prepare for those. And something that we've been thinking about doing is approaching it a little slower and demanding first that this information is public. Because when you know that 90% of emissions are being ignored, that's a very big number. And that's a first step. And then we can talk about, what are you going to compensate? What are you going to meet? What are we going to do about that collectively? So I think, you know, take a step-by-step approach might be interesting, because once you obligate companies to share that number with the public, I think that's very hard to stop then, because people will see that's very disproportional.
Great, thank you, Vivian. All right, well, we have 5 minutes and I have one more question for you, which we have already touched upon. So I hope this is not too much of a challenge. And I want to remind the people in the audience to please send us, whether it's to my email or to in the chat right now, ideas that you might have, really just, even if they're, you know, raw ideas as to what your organization needs, what your community needs, so that we can understand what gaps are and how we can best help you. So the last question for today is, as you know, we have been curating the community of practice for a couple of years now. We have webinars like this one, and we have bilateral meetings with partners and closed door meetings where we discuss strategy. But what other types of exchanges would you like to see happen motivated by CLX within the climate field, and with whom? So just to give an idea, perhaps idea of interdisciplinary communication, and if you know who you would like to talk to, not as in a person, but as a type of expert or type of person, and how we could help you for that. I would be really interested in hearing that. Yes, I will start with Putin.
Yeah, thanks so much, Melina. I guess a couple of things. I think, over the last few years, as I said, it's been really valuable, what CLX has done and how it's, pulled a kind of community of practice together. I think absolutely, on the side of, legal practitioners engaging with experts, I think, that's always been something crucial for specific cases, that many of us are working on. And I think continuing to do more of that would be really useful. I think, the kind of sessions, after each of, some of these cases where, lessons can be learned and shared and so on, that continues to be extremely useful. And I think, continuing with that. The other part, I mean, and I'm speaking from an Africa perspective, is, as I said, we're looking at, us working more closely as lawyers on the continent, and we really, pulling some stuff around that together. And so looking at the role that the CLX can play, given that it's got the kind of global reach in terms of community of practice, how we strengthen the regional, let's say, communities of practice, if you want to call them that, so that there is that interworking, that's happening. That's not the responsibility of CLX, but, people and organizations from those places. But I think CLX can help, provide the connection across all of them. Thanks.
I agree with Stephen that CLX is like a catalyst organization that helps bring people together, and I think that's very important for the field. And I think it's often the case in climate litigation that we accuse the government of unconstitutional omission or action in taking climate impacts into account in their decisions and policies, but we don't necessarily have anything to offer as a solution. And I think climate change litigation would tend to be more effective if we take a constructive approach and instead of just, pointing out wrongs and inefficiencies. And for that reason, I think it's very important for us to start working together with people from other fields. And so I think exchanges between litigators and scientists would something that would be important to be improved in order to provide cases with evidence and robust elements to support them, and to offer something as a solution. So, okay, this is wrong, but what we could be doing instead. I don't know, I think geographers, physicists, public policy specialists, all these people, we already have to talk to all of these people when we're dealing with a particular case. But I think it would be interesting to kind of like organize events where you could, share experiences of different cases that were used. We're talking about similar problems. I don't know, you have the causal link in liability cases, things like that, that could be, draw people to talk about, how scientists and academics can help lawyers in climate litigation. That would be very interesting to see.
I think we're out of time, but very quick, just because I think Vivian was talking about, let's make sure that strategic litigation is strategic, which is a great point. I would say let's make sure that it's strategic in that it's also part of an integrated strategy. So I don't know if you guys at CLX can pool resources about campaigning, how to build communication around a legal case, mobilizing, etc. I know that there are others that have maybe done some publications on that, and perhaps it's a matter of referring people to that. But I do think that, when you are arguing the case inside the courtroom and knocking on doors outside of the courtroom, mobilizing people, I think that kind of helps really to push this very important issue in the agenda and help break those broken narratives that are being advanced by the industry. So I'll stop because we're out of time.
Thank you. Thank you to the three of you. We'll definitely be following up. We'll send a follow-up email with these great ideas and the video recording of the webinar. And I'm sure we will follow up with some of these great ideas to actually make them happen. So thank you to the three of you for coming, and I hope you have a lovely day.